I'm Kirk Kernut.
And I'm Ashley Gordon.
And welcome to another episode of Reading for the Rest of Us. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the politics of literary awards.
But don't be afraid. It's not a bad thing.
It's very controversial. Actually, this show was your suggestion, and you wanted to do a show about the humor and about what's really the one award for humor writing in America in the book industry. It's called the Thurber Prize. Comes out of the James Thurber House in Columbus, Ohio. It's only about a 20-year-old award. What inspired this? What inspired your desire to do this show?
It's probably a bit ironic, as my brother termed me the fun sponge when we were growing up, and my coworkers in one of my earlier jobs deemed me humor impaired. So the fact that I even wanted to do a humor show is probably slightly ironic. But I was struck by it because in the same week I read stories about another prize, the Hugo Award, which is a science fiction prize, and there was a huge dust-up over their nomination process and ultimately the winners, because there were some voters, mostly men, who had deemed themselves the sad puppies, and they felt like that the award had been compromised because over the course of the last few years there were far more nominees of diverse backgrounds, either ethnic or racial backgrounds, and women. And they felt like that the quality of the award had been compromised as the need to be politically correct had expanded the universe of voters. And so they created this group, the Sad Puppies, an even more extreme group called the Rabid Puppies. And they took over the nomination process, and then that created another set of dramas. And ultimately, there were categories where nobody won because the other voters wouldn't vote for the Sad Puppies nominees.
Yeah.
Same week, the Thurber Prize announces its nominees, and it made the news because for the first time ever, the 3 nominees are all women. And the award had never been given to a woman before, although there were maybe 2 or 3 that had been nominated. But this year, because the slate of nominees is all female, it will absolutely go to a woman for the first time ever. So there was, in both of those series of stories, it was, well, are women as talented? Why haven't we been here before? Is there an inherent bias? Are we really lowering the standards? Just it seemed like something worth talking about, and 3 funny books to read.
Well, I think what we see with these awards is sort of a reflection of the larger culture wars that are going on, where people are sort of arguing, are we too politically correct and all this kind of stuff. My own personal feeling is a lot of these awards, have traditionally gone to men, in part because the criteria for what makes good science fiction or what makes good humor tends to prefer men. I guess I would fall into the category where there's a sort of inherent bias in some of the definitions of how people judge it. I mean, I think if you're a male critic, your interests skew you towards picking. It's not unlike going to the movies. The joke about men not wanting to go to see romantic comedies or something like that. So I do think there's some biases in there, and I personally don't have a problem with people wanting to make a conscientious effort to expand out. I think in the case of the Hugos, what's really disconcerting or really upsetting is sort of the way that the argument gets framed. You have a group of people, it was kind of reminding me a lot of what's going on with Donald Trump's campaign and sort of the anger that he's giving voice to, and the idea that that these people are now coming in and taking awards that we should be getting.
Ours. Mm-hmm.
This is something that was ours, that should, we should, and I think the idea is with the Sad Puppies and the Rabid Puppies that, they're really not interested in a dialogue. They want to create a lot of noise, and in a weird way, they've succeeded because this year, Hugos were not awarded in those major categories because they came in and through a sort of voting loophole was able to...
Well, they certainly created a lot of noise.
...pack the slate. And, a couple of them have spoken openly about, wanting to just basically destroy the Hugos. And so I think there's that sort of, we're just going to clear the field, we're going to take our you know, take our bat and balls and go home, and we're not even going to play.
It's interesting that you say that and that you make the correlation with Trump, because I actually read an article just in the last week about voters who would vote against anybody that they think they could win,
right,
simply to blow up the system,
sure,
just to express their disaffection. And then another story, this was on NPR on the radio this week, was about inherent bias in job applications. And to try to condense this, by putting out applications that are gender neutral in their language, or that they put forth, particularly for coders, this is in a high-tech industry, put out a test, essentially, that they have to then solve this problem, and you have no idea who's on the other end solving it, and then you bring people in based on their ability to solve the problem. And they found that they had far more women and minorities in this pool than they ever would have had normally, and that they work quite well on the team. But it was only in this blind environment where either the job applicants would have ever considered themselves for the job, or the company would have considered hiring them.
Right.
So if we could figure out some way to do blind awards.
Well, you know, a lot of contests, a lot of writing contests now do blind awards strictly for that idea, and what they discover is that, you know, they find out that you know, these are usually unpublished awards, because, you know, if you get titles out there that people recognize, they can put names to them, so that kind of defeats the purpose. But, you know, manuscripts will come in, and you really, I think it becomes difficult for judges. You know, you could argue that if you're a judge, you can figure out a woman wrote this because it's about a woman's interest or whatever, but I don't think that holds true exclusively anymore. So I think there's ways of doing it. The difficulty, again, with these types of prizes is we're talking about books that already have names to them.
Right.
And when they come with names, there's a lot of both
there's baggage
prejudices.
that's affixed to all of them. And in the Hugo, these were writers, in some cases, who were quite well known, either as writers or in other venues.
Sure.
So
well, let's talk about the 3 comedy books, and because I think what's interesting about the Thurber Prize is it really challenges our sense of what's funny.
Right.
And, you know, we were talking before the show about comedy in books, or humor in books. And I think in our day and age, we're so used to stand-up comedians and monologues that we're used to, you know, kind of nonstop punchlines all the time. And a lot of these books don't really deliver humor in those kinds of ways. So let's introduce the 3 books and talk about each of them.
All right. Well, they're all the 2 are quite personal. There's Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? And this is Roz Chast, and people would probably recognize her, if you're a New Yorker reader, as she writes cartoons in the New Yorker, and that's probably where she's best known. And then the other that's also quite personal is I See You Made an Effort, Annabelle Gurwitch. And I don't know if she would want me to describe her in this way or not, but she is probably best known for Dinner and a Movie. Okay. She co-hosted a show on a cable channel, and she's done some other bit parts in movies, but seems to be finding really her place as a writer. And then the only satire, the only actual fiction, is Dear Committee Members by Julie Schumacher. And that one is written, it's an epistolary novel. You want to check your English teacher, did she teach you that? And it's letters written by an English professor to his various friends, and letters of recommendation for his students, and it's definitely satire.
You know, it's interesting, it's been just about a year that Dear Committee Members came out, and when that book came out, just because, you know, teaching in a university, a lot of my friends immediately started reading it, were howling, because they've had to write these letters of recommendation.
Yeah, it was quite familiar if you've ever darkened the halls of an English department.
You know, having written 6 of them within the last week myself.
Letters of recommendation.
Yes, I can testify that you do get fatigue very quickly. But what's really striking about this book was there were a lot of people who were emailing me, asking me if I'd read it, who aren't in universities. So I think it's an interesting case. I'm not a big fan of satires about college life or universities, because, you know, maybe I'm a little sensitive about some of the stereotypes or whatever, but it's never struck me as that sort of snobby or stuck up or whatever. But this one really rang outside of the campus as well. And I think part of it is because people who've worked in corporations have also had this.
If you've ever had to struggle through a bureaucracy,
right,
done things that were mind-numbingly boring,
yeah,
over and over and over for seemingly no point.
And when you have to communicate in a language that is formal and professional, and you want to express your feelings, and to be quite honest, a lot of this bureaucratic writing, a guy makes the point in this book, the main character, over and over again, nobody's reading this stuff.
Right.
It's like,
well, you could almost transpose it to a high-tech firm,
sure,
where everybody's using buzzy MBA speak.
Right, right.
When an industry begins to sort of it's circular language where only people on the inside really know what they mean, and they're trigger words and buzzwords, and there was some of that in there that I could see applied to other places, but also the departmental rivalries.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you can see that as well if you love books, if you love words, if God help you, you were an English major, that the whole world will tell you you'll never get a job. And so there's that idea of the poor English department with the falling in ceiling and the asbestos exposure, as opposed to the econ department.
Yeah, that gets all the love.
Yeah.
What I really enjoyed about the book is it does fit really well into the whole tradition of American satire. And one of my favorite comic writers is Christopher Buckley, who's the son of William F. Buckley. But unlike his sort of famously stuffy father, he writes these hilarious political satires. Thank You for Smoking is one. There's Florence of Arabia. And, what he does is he basically takes a hot topic and they're very realistic in the sense. I mean, what he's making fun of is the absurdity of lobbyists or geopolitics.
Right.
And so you get a lot, part of what makes it funny is it's so real in the sense of, I can't believe we're having to deal with this sort of craziness all the time. That's the one, this one actually won the Thurber Prize in 2004. And as you can probably guess from the title, No Way to Treat a First Lady, it is a satire of Bill and Hillary Clinton and the whole Clinton presidency.
Well, politics seems to be something that's easy to make fun of.
Sure.
The people have set themselves up as public figures, and you can push it just the teeniest bit out and make it absurd, but it's not so far out that it seems unrealistic. It's some great movies like Burn After Reading or In the Loop is one of my absolute favorites.
Yeah, that's a great movie.
Wag the Dog. There are lots of really funny satires about politics, but what struck me in these Thurber nominees for this year is that they weren't that.
Yeah.
They weren't obviously funny. The Dear Committee Members as a satire was obviously meant to be funny, although there is a somewhat tragic incident there at the end, which sort of brings it all home. But the other two, particularly, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? This wasn't absurd. Well, I guess it is, but it was very painfully absurd because Roz Chast is talking about and drawing the experience she had as her parents, who had been married 50, 60 years. I mean, she's an only child. It's about their decline and their ultimate death and what she experienced. And there are moments, I guess, of absurdity where you think, seriously, are we going to have to go through this again? But it was also quite honest and very heartbreaking.
Well, I think what you see, first off, just to jump back to the satire and what's easy to satire, an interesting discussion to have is to come back and ask what are we not allowed to satirize anymore. And it sort of struck me when you were talking about that is, 40, 50 years ago, there were tons of war satires, Dr. Strangelove in the movies, but also a lot of books, Catch-22. I don't think you can get away with a lot of war satires in this day and age because people are very sensitive about the military, and I think publishers shy away from those sorts of topics. So you don't see as many of those sort of anti-establishment or sort of anti-conservative types
Politics,
of...
yes,
Yeah.
but the actual
Well,
entities
politics...
and, well, particularly war, where people go through such horrific things,
Yeah.
it doesn't feel funny.
Right, right.
And maybe it's safer. So I see you made an effort is a reference to when you really try very hard at an audition, because not only does she write about turning 50, which is a really scary thing for somebody who's looking it in the eye, but she also talks about going to audition after audition and being an actress in LA and things not quite working out as you had hoped. So maybe the funny of the personal is the safe. Like if I'm making fun of myself, my family, my upbringing, my own foibles, then nobody can accuse me of being insensitive or being unkind. Right. Or
and I think that's ultimately a good thing. I think you know, the type of comedy that I think is important, and this kind of goes back to the Hugo Awards thing, is you've got to make the joke on yourself first before you take on these other targets, because otherwise you just seem, you know, and some people don't like this phrase, they think it's a little weak, but you know, you do come off mean-spirited if your target is always somebody who's not like you, if you're always out making fun of other types of people.
Yeah, but when you look at the other thing that I saw the parallels to was reality television.
Sure.
And the idea of snark, and although in these cases they're mostly making fun about themselves, but I went and perused the home library to see if I had any previous nominees or winners, and I did have David Sedaris, Me Talk Pretty One Day. And from the segregated section where my husband's books are, they have two little shelves of their very own that don't touch mine. There was Rush Limbaugh's Big Fat Idiot by Al Franken, written in 1992, published in 92, and yet incredibly relevant today with many of the very same people.
Same people in it.
Yeah, exactly the same people, but it was total snark.
Yeah.
And he does make fun of himself, so you feel like he's in on the joke.
Well, I think one of the things that's happened since that book is there used to be a real divide between humor and nonfiction prose and sort of the personal essay. And I think those borders have blurred a little bit thanks to people like David Sedaris. I mean, it used to be the humor books were by comedians or humorists, and the nonfiction prose were by quote-unquote writers with a capital W. They were people that we knew first as writers, you know, not so much as comedians. And, you know, we don't ever see a David Sedaris stand-up. We might see him or hear him performing on NPR or...
Well, don't you think that's part of the inherent bias against comedy? Because if you look at awards, the best actor, the best actress, best picture, they're almost always sort of gut-wrenching dramas. Very rarely does a comedic actor get a best award. And then we were talking earlier on today's Writer's Almanac. Help me,
Alison Lurie.
Alison Lurie, is her birthday today, and she was commenting on her books, and she won the Pulitzer in 1985 for Foreign Affairs, and she said it was the only book in which she actually killed off a major character because she liked her characters and she wanted them to have happy endings. So she felt like the award came in part because somebody died.
Right.
So we seem to value tragedy more greatly than humor, but yet when you look at most of these books, there is a tragic element underlying each of them, and it's the humor that allows that individual to survive the tragedy.
Right. I think part of what's going on there is an effort, you know, a lot of times comedy, if it wasn't satirical, sort of biting comedy, it was slapstick. And there have actually been some slapstick books that have won this award. One of the ones that folks may recognize the title is about 8 years ago. It was a book called I Love You, Beth Cooper by this guy Larry Doyle. And they made a terrible, terrible, terrible
not funny,
movie
terrible.
Version of it. And I think one of the things that comes out in that translation from the book to the movie is you could take a subject like adolescence, which in retrospect seems painful, but it's a sort of silly kind of painfulness.
It's a painful that most of us survive.
Right. We all kind of outgrow it. But I think as there's been an effort to take comedy more seriously or to recognize that there's substance to it as opposed to just the sort of silliness, or that it's done to sort of relieve other people's tragedy or the heaviness of life. There's been an effort, I think, to really find the humor in this darker subject matter. It's a big difference from the days of columnists like Irma Bombeck or, Dave Barry, these types of people who
he is so funny. They both
are funny, who are hilarious, but they're not quote unquote deep. They're not taking on these deep life or death subjects like these books that we're talking about are.
And I wonder too if there's some element of commercialism involved.
Sure.
Because when you look at Tina Fey and the success that she's had, or movies like Bridesmaids,
right.
and that all of a sudden they realized, oh, there's another 50% of the population that likes to laugh and can buy books and movie tickets.
Yeah.
So I wonder if some of the broadening isn't a little bit self-serving in that, oh, there's an audience that we could tap into that we really have been neglecting up to this point.
I think you're exactly right, and part of what ends up happening in these books, there's an interesting blend. We said they're not like stand-up comedies, but in a sense what they do start to resemble are kind of sketch comedies. They become sort of, you can imagine these being adapted for the stage, and some of them have. Many of these Thurber Prize winners actually have connection to Saturday Night Live. One of the guys that won one of the early ones, Alan Zeibel, he was a founding writer of Saturday Night Live.
As Al Franken was an early
Al
writer.
Franken, exactly. And you get these people who are able to write situational comedy, if you can think of it that way, with characters and scenes. It's not just the setup and the delivery of the punchline. And I think that's part of the reason that sometimes when you read these books, you're sitting there waiting, okay, when is it funny, when is it funny, when is it funny? Because it's not those constant wisecracks.
No, it isn't, and sometimes it's funny in retrospect.
Right.
You don't necessarily belly laugh your way through the book, but you think about it after having finished, and you laugh about it. Oh, yes, now I get it. Oh, here I am in that same situation. So I do think it's a different kind of funny, but I do think it's quite remarkable that it's such a personal kind of funny.
Yeah.
Whereas with the Al Franken book and the Satire by Julie Schumacher, there's a definite character delivering it to us.
Mm-hmm.
There's the person who's writing it, and then there's the person who's speaking, essentially.
Right.
There's a persona that is between the reader and the author. And I guess in some way that's true for these memoirs, but it feels like it's a persona that is maybe required for them to reveal what they do, because they are such personally open.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, do we have to rip ourselves open quite that far? Is that what we expect of our writers now? Do they need to do that? Is it the writer's need that says, I have to tell about this humiliating thing that happened to me? Does it cut the sting, maybe, when you make it public?
I think there is something definitely to that. One of the winners a few years ago was a guy named David Rakoff, who was David Sedaris essentially discovered him, was mentor of David Rakoff's, and David Rakoff had a really illustrious career writing for magazines and had done several books, and he did a very funny book called Half Empty, but he had sort of had recurring cancer over and over, and he ended up dying in 2012, and a lot of his humor in the latter half of Half Empty was coming to grips with the fact that he was essentially dying. And I think what happens is the ability to laugh is maybe the last thing we can have over mortality. It's like over these very painful things. It's our ability to, it's how we make them maybe not hurt less, but it's the only power we have to solve them, or only power we have over them.
This has become a very heavy discussion for what was supposed to be about a humor award.
We'll both stand up and fall down and get some laughs.
But there's really good news on the humor front.
Sure.
That's timely. one of the funniest books that I've ever read is Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. I tend to laugh at him out loud, just generally. And they are personal, but they're not these searingly gut-wrenching personal things. They're quite funny. I think maybe he has a happy life, or at least he presents one. And Walk in the Woods, the movie is finally being made and opens, I think, this weekend.
Yep,
so
with Robert Redford
I hope
and
I'll get to laugh
Nick
through
Nolte.
that one as much as I did reading that book.
Well, I think it's a good exercise to take books of either of these types and to really sort of challenge your reaction to them. And if you find one that's, a little too gut-wrenching, to ask ourselves, what is funny about this situation. But by the same token, if you find yourself reading one and it just seems to kind of float off the page, that it's so light and so airy, that our temptation may be to sort of dismiss it as frivolous. And I think that's the moment we want to step back and really sort of say, well, why do we have that bias towards the deep? Is that still that tragic thing still
because being
still
funny
coming
is really hard.
Yeah, it is. It's very hard, and I think that
especially being funny that's not at someone else's expense.
Well, and I think part of the reason that this year's nominees are all three women too is we live in a culture where we have this huge debate going on. It should not be a debate. But you hear it all the time. People ask, are women funny?
Are women funny?
And it's the stupidest sort of assertion imaginable.
And not only is it women, but each of them is in the 45 and up range. So are women of a certain age funny?
Well, and I think what we're discovering is the reason that question is out there is because most women have not had the stage or the platform in which to pose these questions, in which to demonstrate that they are indeed funny. And so I think one of the things that you see in these books is really an attempt to sort of grab the spotlight. It's past time, but to take it and say there are issues that need to be talked about. I mean, we've had a zillion teenage boy coming of age sorts of comedies.
We all know what y'all go through.
Yes. So, what else is there that can, that is humorous, but hasn't been talked about to death? And the reality is at least 2 out of these 3 books, I think, really explore those issues. Now, my own guess, are you going to pick a winner?
I couldn't possibly, and I was actually thinking, I'm really glad that I don't have to pick, because each of them has tremendous merit in its own right, and I never would have put them in the same category to begin with. So I can't even imagine how you would choose.
I do think it's a very difficult thing because, like you say, they're each funny in their own way, but they're also about such different subjects.
Completely different. And the delivery in each is completely different. One being primarily a graphic novel. And, one thing we didn't say, that in the Dear Committee Member, it's written from a male perspective
That's
by
a good
woman.
point to make.
But I don't think you would know who wrote it.
Yeah. Well, the Thurber Awards will be announced in about a month and a half, so we'll definitely on a future show sort of come back to this and talk a little bit about it and see who won and why they won.
And we'll know for sure that this time it will be a woman.
A woman.
The first
exactly.
one.
Exactly. All right. Well, it was as always, it was a fast
It didn't go the direction we thought it would go at all.
It never does.
So I hope you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for another episode, and thank you for being here. And we will talk to you soon. In the meantime, remember, read a book.
Read a good book.